The hum of the machine was the only sound in the study. It was a sound I knew intimately, the quiet, steady whir of a high-performance solid-state drive inside the laptop I had personally selected, configured, and optimized for my husband. The study itself was my creation too. The slate-gray walls, the recessed lighting, the standing desk I'd assembled while he was on a golf trip. I had built the entire ecosystem of his professional life, the silent, efficient infrastructure that allowed him to glide through his days. And on the glowing screen of that laptop, in the cool blue light of a messaging app, I saw the single line of text that decommissioned our marriage. It wasn't addressed to me, it was about me. A status report delivered to his mentor, Renee. "She trusts me completely," Vaughn had typed. "That's why this works." It wasn't the words that broke me, it was the engineering of it, the clinical assessment. He wasn't confessing an affair, he was presenting a project update. Trust wasn't the foundation of our love. It was a feature to be exploited. It was a security vulnerability in my own operating system, and he, the lead developer, had just shared the exploit with a third-party consultant. The air in the room didn't just change, it solidified. My breath caught not in a sob, but in a quiet, final click, like a server shutting down. The background processes of my heart, the constant, low-level hum of affection, concern, and planning for our future, all ceased at once. There was only silence and clarity. My name is Keisha. I am 34 years old, and for the last 7 of those years, I have been an IT project manager. My job is to take chaos and turn it into a predictable, manageable system. I create timelines, allocate resources, identify dependencies, and mitigate risks. I build Gantt charts that map the future, turning a vague idea into a series of logical, executable steps. Vaughn was 37. We had been married for 5 years, together for 8. Long enough that our life felt like a mature project, past the frantic launch phase and into a steady state of managed operations. I thought we were co-leads, 2 experienced managers executing a shared strategic vision. I see now that I was mistaken. I wasn't the co-lead. I was the lead systems architect, the network administrator, the on-call tech support, and the unpaid vendor manager for the project of Vaughn's life. And he had just outsourced the project governance to someone else. That sentence, "She trusts me completely, that's why this works," was the inciting wound because it wasn't about another woman. It was about me. It wasn't a confession of his weakness, but a celebration of mine. He saw my trust not as a gift to be cherished, but as a tool to be used. The phrase, "That's why this works," was the part that echoed in the sudden stillness of my mind. This? What was this? The close mentorship with Renee? The late-night strategy sessions? The trips I wasn't invited on? The budget I no longer had visibility into? It was all of it. This was the new system he was building, a system that ran parallel to our marriage, and its primary power source was my faith in him. He was draining my resources to power a project I hadn't even known was on the roadmap. An IT project manager knows that most catastrophic system failures don't happen because of one big explosion. They happen because of erosion. A series of small, unaddressed warnings. A slow degradation of performance that you get used to, that you start to accept as normal. The server gets a little louder each month. The response time lags by a few more milliseconds, but you keep working, you keep compensating because the cost of a full diagnostic and overhaul seems too high. My marriage didn't fail on the night I read that message. It had been failing for years, one ignored error log at a time. The archaeology of our disrespect began, ironically, with an act of love. When Vaughn decided to leave his corporate job to start his own consulting business 2 years ago, I was his biggest champion. He had the vision, the charisma. I had the practical skills to build the machine he would pilot. Our spare bedroom, cluttered with old college furniture and boxes of memories, was to become his command center. "I just need a space where I can think," he'd said, waving a hand vaguely at the room. "Simple. A desk, a chair." But I saw the system, not just the furniture. He didn't just need a desk. He needed an ergonomic workstation with dual monitors to reduce neck strain. He didn't just need a chair. He needed a lumbar-supported, 8-hour rated task chair to prevent fatigue. He needed a high-speed mesh Wi-Fi network with a dedicated access point in that room to ensure his video calls never dropped. He needed a cable management system to keep the floor clear of trip hazards. He needed a cloud-based backup solution for his data with automated hourly snapshots. I spent an entire 3-day weekend executing the project. I painted the walls a calming slate gray I'd read was conducive to focus. I researched, ordered, and then assembled the flat-pack furniture, the Swedish instructions spread across the floor like ancient scrolls. I remember the specific, plasticky smell of the new monitor cables as I uncoiled them, the satisfying click as the Ethernet cord snapped into the port. I spent 2 hours on my hands and knees, threading power bricks and HDMI cables through a zippered fabric sleeve, my fingers aching, until the space behind his desk was as clean and organized as a server rack. Vaughn's role in this project was that of an executive stakeholder. He'd pop in every few hours with a cup of coffee for me and a series of observations. "Are you sure the desk should go there? The light from the window might create glare." I would then patiently explain that I had already mapped the sun's path and chosen the optimal position for screen visibility throughout the workday. "Maybe we should get a bigger plant," he'd suggest, looking at the small succulent I'd placed on the shelf. He was curating the aesthetic while I was building the core infrastructure. When it was finished, he walked in and beamed. "Wow, Kay. This is incredible. It looks like a real office." He ran his hand over the smooth surface of the desk. He sat in the chair and spun around. He was delighted with the result, the final deliverable. He never once mentioned the process. He never said, "Thank you for spending 40 hours of your life, a holiday weekend, building this for me." He said, "This is great," as if the office had simply materialized from his vision. I, the project manager, the technician, the installer, was invisible. At the time, his happiness was enough. I saw it as my contribution to our shared success, a contaminated memory. Now I hear the truth. He wasn't seeing a partner's sacrifice. He was reviewing a vendor's work, and the vendor was free. The external consultant, Renee, was introduced about 6 months after the office was complete. Vaughn met her at a networking event for entrepreneurs. He came home buzzing, electric with a kind of energy I hadn't seen in him for a long time. "You will not believe who I met," he said, dropping his keys in the bowl by the door. "Renee Martin. She's a legend. Built a 7-figure marketing agency from scratch, and she wants to mentor me." I was thrilled for him. "Vaughn, that's amazing. What's she like?" "She's just sharp. She gets it. She thinks I'm playing too small." The first time I met Renee was a month later, at an awards dinner for local business owners. She was exactly as I'd pictured. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, with a smile that was bright but didn't quite reach her eyes. When Vaughn introduced us, she gave me a handshake that was firm and brief, a transaction. "So you're the famous Keisha," she said, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. It wasn't a compliment. It was a data capture. Vaughn talks about you all the time. All good things, I hope, I said, trying to match her light, professional tone. He tells me you're the one who keeps his world running, she said, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Vaughn, a small knowing smile on her face. It's so important for a visionary to have good support staff. The words hung in the air between us. Support staff. Not a partner. Not a wife. An employee. Vaughn, standing beside me, just beamed, proud that this powerful woman was acknowledging his… what? His brilliance? His foresight in securing such efficient help? He didn't defend me. He didn't correct her. He just nodded as if to say, yes, this is my highly effective administrator. I felt myself shrink. In that moment, I was no longer Keisha, the IT project manager with a successful career of her own. I was an accessory to his ambition. That night, I tried to talk to him about it. She called me your support staff, Vaughn. He was taking off his tie, humming. Yeah, she's direct. That's her style. She meant it as a compliment to you. How is that a compliment? She's saying you're organized, that you're capable. She sees how much you do for me. Or, I said, my voice quiet, she sees me as your assistant. He finally stopped and looked at me, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. You're overthinking it, Kay. That's just how people talk in her world. It's business language. Don't be so sensitive. He dismissed my feeling, reframing it as my inability to understand his new, elevated world. It was the first time I felt the echo. He was using her lens to interpret our life. The echo pattern became a regular feature of our marriage. Phrases and ideas that felt alien to Vaughn's usual way of thinking began to pepper his conversation. One night, he announced he was rebranding. I need to start thinking of myself not as a consultant, but as a thought leader, he declared over dinner. I need to leverage my personal brand to scale my impact. I paused, my fork halfway to my mouth. Leverage your personal brand? Where did that come from? He bristled. Renee and I were talking. She thinks I have a unique value proposition that isn't being properly articulated in the marketplace. It was like he was reading from a script written by Renee. The man who used to talk about helping clients solve problems was now talking about articulating value propositions. The language was a barrier, a deliberate wall of jargon designed to make his work sound more complex and important than it was, and to make me feel like an outsider who couldn't possibly understand. This was when he first used the line that would become a refrain. I asked a practical question about his rebranding plan. Okay, so what does that look like in terms of deliverables? A new website? A blog? Are we talking about a marketing budget? He sighed, the sound of a patient teacher explaining a complex theorem to a slow student. This is strategy, Keisha. High-level thinking. Renee helps me think. You wouldn't get it. You wouldn't get it. 3 words that neatly cleaved our partnership in 2. There was his world, the important, strategic world of thought leadership and leveraged brands. And there was my world, the mundane, practical world of budgets and deliverables. And never the twain shall meet. He was building a professional life that, by design, had no room for his wife's input, even though his wife was a professional who managed complex projects for a living. My expertise was welcome when it involved crawling under a desk with a fistful of zip ties, but it was dismissed when it involved the strategic planning of his business, the business I had sacrificed my time and energy to help launch. The erosion continued, seeping into every part of our domestic life. My role as the default tech support became a source of constant, low-grade resentment. It was always presented as a compliment. When our smart TV refused to connect to the new router, he fiddled with it for 5 minutes, huffed in frustration, and then tossed the remote on the couch. "This thing is a piece of junk," he'd grumble. I'd pick up the remote, navigate through 3 submenus, re-enter the Wi-Fi password, and have it working in 60 seconds. He'd look over from his phone, unsurprised. "See? You're just better at this stuff than I am." One Saturday, he called me in a panic. He was at a coffee shop, about to have a virtual meeting with a potential client, and his laptop wouldn't connect to the public Wi-Fi. I spent 20 minutes on the phone with him, patiently walking him through the steps of clearing his browser cache and renewing his DHCP lease. It was work. It was unpaid, unacknowledged technical labor. When he finally connected, he was relieved. "You're a lifesaver, Kay," he said. And then he added the line, "You handle all the tech stuff because you're just so much better at it." It's a compliment, really. It wasn't a compliment. It was an abdication. It was a convenient narrative that allowed him to remain willfully incompetent in the basic technologies that ran our modern lives because he had free, on-demand IT support living in his house. What had once been a partnership where we both contributed our skills had become a service-level agreement where I was the provider and he was the client. A client who never paid his invoices. The invisible labor cataloged itself in my mind. The time I spent an entire afternoon on the phone with our health insurance company, disputing a claim they'd denied for him. He hated paperwork and phone trees, so I did it. The weekend I researched and hired a plumber to fix a leak under the sink while he was at a strategy retreat with Renee, which I later discovered was a spa weekend in the Poconos. I was the one who managed the automated bill payments for our mortgage, our cars, our utilities, all running silently from a joint account that I primarily funded, because his income was variable. I had built a domestic operating system for our life that was so efficient, so seamless, that he had forgotten it existed. He just enjoyed the flawless user experience, never thinking about the code running in the background. His secrecy grew in direct proportion to his dependence on me. He stopped talking about the specifics of his work. When I'd ask how his day was, he'd give me a vague, "Good, busy." If I pressed for details, for the kind of granular, everyday stories that couples share, he would get defensive. "I don't want to bore you with the details," he'd say. "It doesn't bore me, Vaughn. I'm interested in your life." That's when he delivered the third of his devastatingly casual lines. We were washing dishes, the warm water and soap suds a familiar comfort. I had asked a simple question about a client he'd mentioned weeks ago. "Look, Keisha," he said, turning to face me, his hands dripping. "I don't tell you everything because you overanalyze. You turn everything into a project. You ask about timelines and risks and budgets. Sometimes I just need to be able to think without having to justify every step." He was framing my intelligence as a burden. My competence was an inconvenience. The very skills I used to manage our life and support his career were now the reason he cited for shutting me out. He needed a silent partner, not an active one. A cheerleader, not a strategist. He was building a wall between us, and the bricks were my own strengths. Which brings me back to the study, to the laptop, to the final error message that the system could not ignore. He had a huge pitch the next morning, a potential client that could, in his words, change everything. He was nervous. The night before, he'd been pacing the living room, rehearsing his lines. The presentation deck was beautiful, dynamic, clean, and persuasive. I knew, because I had designed it for him. I'd spent the previous weekend choosing the color palette, creating the master slides, and embedding the video assets. He'd given me the raw text in a Word document. I had transformed it into a story. "Could you just do one last check for me?" he'd asked before he went to bed. Make sure the videos are running smoothly. Check the presenter notes. You know, your magic. So there I was, at 11 o'clock at night in the office I built, working on the laptop I configured to perfect the presentation I designed for the business I helped launch. I was performing my role as support staff, just as Renee had defined it. The presentation was fine. The videos loaded perfectly. But as I went to close the file, I noticed the icon for his messaging app was bouncing in the dock. A new message had come in. Usually, I would have ignored it. I wasn't a snoop. Oh, my trust in him, as he so accurately noted, was complete. But something about the last few months, the echoes of Renee's voice, the jargon, the secrecy, had created a small, persistent flag in my internal monitoring system. A low-priority alert that I had been consistently ignoring. I clicked the icon. The thread with Renee was at the top. I told myself I was just going to close it. But my eyes caught her name and then his words. A wall of text. My gaze snagged on a sentence, then another. I didn't mean to scroll up, but my finger did it automatically. I scrolled past last week, past last month, past the last 6 months. It wasn't a love affair, not in the traditional sense. There were no declarations of passion, no sordid details. It was, in some ways, worse. It was a business merger. They discussed clients, strategy, financials. They celebrated wins he'd never mentioned to me. They analyzed losses he'd hidden from me. They had a shared professional intimacy that was deeper and more detailed than the life he shared with me. I was the silent, sleeping partner in a marriage, while they were active, engaged collaborators in his life. I read about my own birthday party, which I had planned. Have to jump off, he'd written to her. Keisha's got a whole thing planned. You know how she is. It was followed by an eye-roll emoji. He had described my effort, my love, as a tedious obligation. I read about the weekend I'd spent fixing our deck. Kay is doing one of her projects, so I have the whole weekend to grind on the Miller proposal. My labor wasn't a gift. It was a convenience that freed up his time. And then I saw it. The conversation from that very evening. Renee had asked if he was ready for the big pitch tomorrow. He wrote back, "Ready as I'll ever be. The deck Keisha made is killer. She's amazing at that stuff." Renee replied, "Doesn't she ever ask questions? About me? About how much time we spend talking?" And there it was. The fatal line. Vaughn's reply. "She trusts me completely. That's why this works." My world didn't shatter. It clarified. In my job, there's a moment when you realize a project is irrevocably off the rails. The budget is blown, the timeline is shot, and the core objectives are no longer achievable. You can keep pushing, keep patching, keep pretending you can save it. Or you can make the hard, clean decision. You can cancel the project. You can write off the sunk costs and reallocate the resources to something that has a chance of success. In that moment, I canceled the project of my marriage. The sensation wasn't anger or heartbreak. It was the quiet, cold hum of a decision being made. It was the feeling of a system rebooting in safe mode. All non-essential programs terminated. My mind, which had been cluttered with the emotional malware of doubt and resentment, was suddenly wiped clean. I had one objective, a single, clear directive: execute the exit protocol. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I didn't wake him up and demand an explanation. An explanation was irrelevant. The data was clear. To demand that he explain his actions would be like asking a piece of faulty code to debug itself. The logic was inherently flawed. Instead, I stood up from the desk, went into our bedroom, and looked at him sleeping. He looked peaceful, innocent. The comfortable parasite, resting, secure in the health of his host. I felt nothing, no rage, no sorrow, just a profound and unnerving stillness. I was no longer in the system. I was an administrator viewing it from the outside. The next morning, I was the perfect wife. I made him coffee. I steamed his suit. I ran through the presentation with him one last time, offering encouragement. "You've got this, Vaughn. You're going to be brilliant." He kissed me on the forehead as he left, a gesture of casual ownership. "Couldn't do this without you, Kay," he said, the unbearable irony of his words hanging in the air. "Wish me luck." "You won't need it," I said. My voice was even. My smile was steady. He had no idea I was wishing him goodbye. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I opened my own laptop. I didn't have a plan, but my mind, trained in process and logistics, began to build one automatically. I opened a new project management document. The project title was simple: Life V2.0. The first task was secure independent housing. I spent an hour on rental websites, filtering by neighborhood, price, and immediate availability. I found a one-bedroom apartment in Federal Hill, a part of Baltimore I'd always loved, with large windows and a view of the harbor. I submitted an application using the documents I already had saved in my personal cloud storage: pay stubs, bank statements, letter of employment. My financial life was in order. I had always been the one to manage it. The second task was asset reallocation. I logged into our joint bank account. I calculated, to the dollar, my contributions for the last 2 years, including a spreadsheet I'd kept of major household expenses I'd covered from my personal savings. I transferred exactly that amount, no more, no less, to my own account. Then I systematically went through every utility, every subscription, every service that I had set up and managed. I logged into the electricity provider, the gas company, the internet service. I removed myself as an authorized user. I went into our shared calendar and revoked his access to mine. My life was suddenly, digitally, my own. The final and most critical task was data migration. I went back to his laptop. I created a folder on a secure thumb drive. I methodically downloaded every important document I had ever created or managed for him: tax returns, business expense spreadsheets, vendor contracts for his website designer and accountant, the master files for his branding and logos. Everything. I didn't delete the originals from his machine. I simply made my own copy. It was my work product, my intellectual property. Then I unsynced his messaging app. I cleared the cache. I logged out of every account. I left the machine on, the screen glowing, open to a blank desktop. The infrastructure was still there, but the administrator had revoked all access. The system was now his to manage. I called one friend. My sister, really. Maya. When she picked up, I didn't cry or explain. I just said, "It's done. I'm leaving him." There was no surprise in her voice, only a deep, weary relief. "Okay," she said, her voice calm and steady. "What's the plan?" I laid it out for her like a project manager in a kickoff meeting. "My application was just approved. I signed the lease at 3. Movers are coming Thursday morning at 9. He has an all-day session with Renee. I'll be there at 8, she said. No questions, no judgment. Just immediate resource deployment. The next 2 days were an exercise in surreal performance art. Vaughn came home that first night, elated. He'd gotten the client. "We did it, baby," he shouted, lifting me up in a hug. I felt like a ghost in my own home. My body there, but my spirit already in that apartment in Federal Hill. I smiled. I congratulated him. I made his favorite dinner to celebrate. He talked for hours about the future, our future, built on the foundation of this new success. He was so full of plans, so completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath his feet was already gone. He didn't notice the quiet in me. He was so used to me being his silent infrastructure that my silence didn't register as a change. It was just the normal, expected hum of a system working perfectly. Thursday morning arrived. Vaughn left at 7:30, dressed in one of his new thought leader outfits, a tailored blazer and expensive jeans. "Big day," he said, kissing me quickly. "Renee's taking the whole team through a quarterly planning intensive." "Have a great session," I said, handing him the travel mug of coffee I had made. The last coffee I would ever make for him. At 8:45, Maya pulled up. At 9, the movers arrived. We worked with quiet, methodical efficiency. My life fit into 53 boxes. We took my clothes, my books, my kitchen supplies, the art I had bought, the chair from my grandmother. We left his things untouched. We left the furniture we'd bought together. I walked through the house one last time. The study I had built looked sterile, impersonal. On the desk, his laptop sat open, waiting for commands the user no longer knew how to give. I didn't leave a note. The empty space was the message. My absence was the final project report. By 2 o'clock, my boxes were in my new apartment. The movers left. Maya and I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the architecture of my new life. The sun streamed through the big windows, glinting off the harbor. The air smelled of fresh paint and freedom. "You okay?" Maya asked softly. I took a deep breath. The air felt different here, lighter. "I think I am," I said, and for the first time in days, I felt the clinical stillness in my chest begin to thaw. A single tear traced a path down my cheek, not of sadness, but of release. The project was complete. The first texts from Vaughn started at 6:15 that evening. "Hey, running late. Renee is taking us out for drinks to celebrate the new client." An hour later. "Just leaving now. You eat yet?" Then, at 7:45, "Home. Where are you?" A pause. Then, a few minutes later, "Is this a joke? Why is your closet empty?" And then the frantic calls began, one after another. I watched his name flash on my screen, my phone silent on the counter. The calls went to voicemail. The first voicemail was pure confusion. "Keisha, call me. I don't understand what's going on. Half your stuff is gone. This isn't funny." The second voicemail, an hour later, was angry. "What the hell is this, Keisha? You just pack up and leave without a word? After everything? This is so incredibly dramatic and immature. Whatever I did, we're married. We're supposed to talk about it. Call me back. Now." He was already framing it as my failure, my immaturity, my drama. He was managing the narrative. The next day, he recruited allies. His mother called me. "Keisha, dear, Vaughn is beside himself. He said you just disappeared. He's so worried. He loves you so much. Please, whatever this is, just go home and talk to him." "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Henderson," I said, my voice polite and distant. "But this is between Vaughn and me. I'm not going to discuss it with you." I was establishing new security protocols, new firewalls. Access to my inner life was no longer a public network. Then came the negotiation phase. An email landed in my inbox with the subject line, "We can fix this." It was a long, rambling message. He was sorry he'd been distant. He admitted he'd been spending too much time on work, that he'd been relying on Renee too much. He said he'd been under a lot of pressure. He promised to cut back his hours. He offered couples counseling. He wrote, "I'll do whatever it takes. Just come home. I can't do this without you." That was the line that told me he still didn't understand. I can't do this without you. It still wasn't about love. It was about functionality. He wasn't mourning the loss of his wife. He was panicking at the loss of his systems administrator. I knew I had to see him one last time, to formally close the project. I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a quiet cafe halfway between my new apartment and our old house. He looked terrible. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes were wrinkled. He looked like a man whose entire support system had been unplugged. He started talking before I had even sat down. A torrent of apologies, promises, and accusations. He didn't understand. He thought everything was fine. He had just landed the biggest client of his career. This was supposed to be their time. I let him talk. I listened quietly, nodding, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea. When he finally ran out of steam, his shoulders slumped in defeat, I spoke. My voice was quiet, even. "I know about the messages, Vaughn." The color drained from his face. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He tried to recover, to deflect. "What messages? I don't know what you're talking about." "The thread with Renee," I said calmly. "On your laptop. I saw it the night before your pitch." He flinched, then his expression hardened. The panic in his eyes was replaced by a flash of anger. He had found his narrative. He wasn't the betrayer. I was the transgressor. "So that's it," he said, his voice low and incredulous. "You blew up our marriage, our entire life, because you were snooping through my private messages?" He leaned forward, his voice rising. "You didn't even have the decency to talk to me, to ask me about it. You just acted like a spy in your own home." He shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face, as if he were the one who had been wronged. And then he delivered the line, the final, revealing piece of his flawed code. "You broke us, Keisha. You broke us by snooping instead of asking." I looked at him, really looked at him, the man I had loved, the man I had built a world for, and I felt a deep, profound pity. He honestly believed it. He believed the problem wasn't his deception, but my discovery of it. The sin wasn't the betrayal, but the act of witnessing the betrayal. I set my cup down on its saucer, the small click echoing in the space between us. I met his angry, wounded gaze, and I asked a simple, clarifying question. "Ask you what, Vaughn?" I said, my voice level, without a trace of heat. "Ask you to tell me the truth you were already typing to her?" He had no answer. His entire argument collapsed under the weight of that simple logic. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had built his defense on the idea that my trust was something he was entitled to, and that my verification of that trust was a greater crime than his violation of it. "The messages didn't break us," I continued quietly. "They just documented why we were already broken. You weren't running a business with a mentor, Vaughn. You were building a life with a different partner. I was just the legacy system you kept running in the background to manage the boring stuff." I stood up. "I'm not angry," I said, and it was the truth. "I'm just done. The project is over." I walked out of the cafe and didn't look back. The first few months were about rebuilding, not my heart, but my life. My new apartment was my first solo project. I painted the walls a warm, buttery yellow. I bought a real toolbox and learned how to hang my own shelves. I set up my own network, my own automated bill payments, my own digital and domestic infrastructure. And every small act of self-sufficiency felt like a quiet revolution. My work had always been my sanctuary, but now it became my focus. The skills I had poured into Vaughn's business, I now poured into my own career. I took on more complex projects, managed larger teams. I discovered that when I wasn't spending 20 hours a week as an unpaid consultant, IT support, and administrator for my husband, I had a shocking amount of energy and ambition for myself. 6 months after I left, I pitched a new initiative at my company, a dedicated consulting arm for small businesses, helping them build the kind of tech infrastructure I had built for Vaughn. My boss loved it. A year later, I was running my own team. We were helping entrepreneurs, real visionaries, build their dreams on solid foundations. I was getting paid and acknowledged for the work I had always done for free. My name was on the door. I saw Vaughn once, about a year and a half after I left. I was grabbing coffee near my office. He was standing in line, looking smaller than I remembered. His suit was a little rumpled. He was tapping impatiently at his phone, a frustrated look on his face. He looked ordinary. Not a monster, not a villain, just a man who had outsourced his life and was now struggling with the user manual. Our eyes met. A flicker of something, panic, regret, surprise, crossed his face. He gave a small, hesitant wave. I gave him a polite, distant nod, the kind you give a former colleague you barely knew. Then I turned back to the counter, collected my coffee, and walked out into the bright Baltimore sunshine. I felt no anger, no triumph. I felt nothing at all. It was like looking at a closed project file, an archive from a long time ago. It's funny what you learn when a system fails. You learn where the single points of failure were. You learn which dependencies were unsustainable. Vaughn saw my trust as a vulnerability, a loophole to be exploited. But trust isn't a weakness. It's the most powerful resource there is. It's just that you have to allocate it wisely. I had invested all of my trust in a project that was designed, from the start, to fail me. Love isn't supposed to be one person becoming the silent, uncredited infrastructure for another person's life. It's supposed to be a redundant system, a partnership with fail-safes and shared loads, so that when one part of the system is under stress, the other can handle the capacity. We didn't have that. We had a single server running on one person's energy, and it was bound to overheat. I didn't leave a marriage. I just migrated my life from a failing local server to a secure, independent cloud that I owned and controlled completely. I finally built a system with no single point of failure. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.